So, hello everyone. My name is Paul Grenier. I'm with the Simone Weil Center, or Simone Center for Political Philosophy. And this is the second in a fall series that we've initiated on the general theme of technology and civilization. I was struck when thinking about this topic, today's topic, which is technocracy and the pandemic, by the contrast between Denmark and the area in the United States where I live. In Denmark, where I have a very close friend, who told me that children at no point have ever had to wear masks. Rarely have, if at all, have schools for small children been shut, and at no point did children wear masks. And it seems, apparently in Denmark, it's just obvious to everyone that that's the way things work. It's just, why would you do that? Why would you do anything else? Whereas in the part of the United States where I live, in the mid-Atlantic region and many other parts of America, it's equally obvious to everyone that, of course, children should wear masks. It's safer. Or it's allegedly safer. Or if it might be safer, then of course they should do so. But what's striking about this is that the decision to do one thing or the other, given that it's obvious to the people in both areas, suggests that what we're talking about here are really just different civilizations. Because this is a really fundamental difference. Which one is better? And on what basis would you choose which decision or which civilization is better? Or is it just a neutral choice, having no moral sort of meaning to it? And that leads us to the question, which is really the focus of today's discussion, led by Father Stefano Zamagni, which is, is this whole question of the response to the pandemic, not just whether we wear masks, but whether we take vaccines and whether we have vaccine mandates if we do take vaccines. Isn't this really a question about what it means to be a human being? What does it mean to be a child? What is it? And the field that answers that question is called Anthropology. And specifically in this case, what you would call philosophical-anthropology. And which is precisely why we've asked Stefano to lead this discussion, because this has really been the focus of his doctoral work for many years. I guess to connect this more broadly with the work of the Simone Weil Center. I mean, in general, what we try to do is to bring a philosophical perspective to political issues and in particular to issues of international political importance. So it seems obvious that how people in different parts of the world are going to define what it means to be civilized, what civilization is an obviously good kind of problem for our approach to take on. And hello, Dr. Bhattarcharya, you warned us you might be a few minutes late. You haven't missed really anything. We were just about to get into introductions. And I'll start by introducing our speaker, Father Stefano Zamagni, who is in the doctoral program in theology at the John Paul II Institute, which is affiliated with the Catholic University in Washington. And at the John Paul II Institute, he studied, among others, with friends of ours and of our center, David C. Schindler and Michael Hanby. He also has a master's in philosophy from the University of Turin. And as you can see, he's a young man. And just this summer, he was ordained a Catholic priest in Rome. But fortunately, we have him back in Washington now with us to help us think through these issues. And so moving right along, we're honored to have with us again, Governor Jerry Brown, who, for those of you who don't know, although I suspect everyone does know, he served 4 terms as governor of California, first in the 70s and early 80s, and then once again starting in 2010 through 2018. In between those duties. He also served as the mayor of Oakland. But aside from that, and what is equally important from our perspective is that for many years, Governor Jerry Brown has been an inspiring public intellectual, one of the few, in my opinion, political leaders in America who's also an intellectual thought leader. Next up, I'm going into roughly modified alphabetical order here of names. So it is Dr. J. Bhattarcharya, who's professor of medicine at Stanford University, where he also has an appointment as a professor of economics, as I understand it. Like many of these eminent Stanford professor types, they have multiple areas of expertise and appointments, and I can never really keep track of all of them. I just think you do biostatistics, and I don't know what else, economic research. But many of you probably know of Dr. Bhattarcharya from the renown or notoriety, depending on your perspective, he gained as one of the three founders of the Great Barrington Initiative, which was early on offered as an alternative to lockdowns. And as many of you will recall, the Great Barrington Declaration, I should call it, was a topic of sort of intense and very thoughtful debate throughout the country, and that I am allowing myself this one instance of sarcasm, and I will never do that again. There was no thoughtfulness about it at all. It was quite amazing how it was studiously ignored and distorted, in my opinion. But I'm violating the rules of academic objectivity, I'm afraid, so I'll stop doing that as well. Next up, Aaron Hariyati, who we're also very pleased to have with us and honored, just as much as everyone else, who, in addition to his philosophical interest and deep training, has for some years now been professor of psychiatry at the University of California at Irvine. He was also there at the School of Medicine, the director of the medical ethics program at UCI. He's also serves as chairman of the medical ethics committees at University of California Irvine Hospital and for the California Department of State Hospitals. And we're proud to say he's also an advisor to the Simone Weil Center. And almost last, Adam Webb is with us. Adam, are you in England or China or Italy, or where are you nowadays?
I'm in Spain at the moment. I pop up various places, but yeah, I'm in Spain for the next few weeks at least.
Yeah, tough life. I really feel for you, Adam. It's always from some other country every time I get an email. But Adam is another advisor, almost from the beginning, since 2017 is when we started the center. And he's the American co-director and professor of political science at the Johns Hopkins Nanjing Center in China, where he's professor of political science. But his field is really much broader than political science. He's interested in the problems of globalization, in various critiques of modernity. He's deeply familiar with many different civilizations in the world. And someone who's helped us formulate our inquiries into the present, in today's topic as well. So thank you so much for being there. And so I think that is, we're good as far as introductions are concerned, and I've already taken up enough time. Let's go straight now to the presentation by Father Stefano.
Thank you, Paul. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my work so that I may be helped see the truth a bit more clearly, with your help. So our current circumstances represent something novel in history. COVID-19 is the first epidemic that the postmodern society has faced. We are offered a propitious opportunity to consider what conception of man, what concept of his relationship with his fellow man and with God has guided Western society in the last 50 years. What anthropology is presupposed by the reaction of the political world and cultural elites to the first epidemic of the technological age? This is the most basic question that we must address. At the beginning of the epidemic, some journalists and intellectuals, especially in Christian circles, pointed out that we were observing the defeat of science, which had to retreat and recognize its own powerlessness. This was a naive and superficial reading of the events to the extent that it identified the science only with what happens in research laboratories or hospitals, as well as with the technological tools that scientific progress provides. In truth, the mobilization of science and biotechnology in the face of the epidemic has brought to light the true face of postmodern Western culture. In fact, the decision to impose a general lockdown is not an indication of the defeat of science, but entirely to the contrary. It shines a light on the common presupposition that, confronted with any serious issue, only science can possibly offer a way forward. When science was temporarily in difficulty, there simply could be no other possibility but to stop all of public life and wait for scientific and technological development to take its course, offering the necessary conditions for a return to life. The lockdown, which was then followed by the vaccine, marks then a victory of a scientific and pragmatic anthropology, according to which man's life is determined by his ability to adapt to ever new conditions through ever new inventions. A distinctive feature of pragmatic scientism is its practical rejection, followed later by the intellectual denial of ancient and medieval metaphysics. In fact, the latter is accused of describing the world in a static way, as it is populated by beings whose essence appears fixed and unchangeable. In the eyes of modern men, however, nothing is established once and for all. And indeed, the negation of what is presently given is actively sought. In the spirit of pragmatism, disease and death, which humanity has to deal with in a special way during a time of pandemic, are conceived as problems to be solved instead of realities to be faced. The question about how man can overcome this or that problem crowds out the what question. In other words, it crowds out the question, what is the reality that we are confronting in the first place? Since nothing is fixed, this what ends up being continuously built and rebuilt. From this point of view, the time of epidemic presents itself as a propitious time for development and the progress of science. And indeed, it is also such for all the other aspects of bourgeois society. The modern mentality is characterized by the search for novelty as a value in itself, so much so that the present and past lose meaning except insofar as they serve as material for progress toward that perfect society that is always in the process of coming into being. Homo progressivus will either deny or otherwise exploit for his own ends anything that does not adapt to the unstoppable flow of history. This evolutionary progressive mentality has now established itself as all-encompassing. Indeed, it is only with great difficulty that this mentality can be even be named, much less questioned. Scientism and technocracy constitute the ocean in which we swim, so much so that the possibility of framing human existence in any other way hardly comes to mind. Far from allowing men to live in a true and good way, restrictive measures such as lockdowns, social distancing, and mass vaccination prevent man from being what he is, a creature that is called to love the other and ultimately to love God. The logic of technocracy makes obsolete the subject's answer to the objective call to love. Man is a relational being who fulfills his nature from within the constitutive relationship with God that expresses itself in the spiritual being's relationship with one's own body and with the other. I will focus the rest of my presentation on the anthropology that made possible the initial ideological commitment to vaccination and which continues to legitimate it. Two reasons, it seems to me, justify this choice of subject matter. Firstly, the current political debate on vaccine mandates is founded on the technocratic anthropology that, however implicitly and silently, underlies both science and politics. For the sake of brevity, I will address the scientific question and not the political one. Secondly, it will be interesting to understand why the need for vaccination has, from the very beginning, oriented Western society's response to the epidemic, to the point that other treatments developed at an earlier stage, though likely of use in treating the disease, have been marginalized. In short, I suggest that both lockdowns and mass vaccination pursue the same universal, undifferentiated preemptive strategy. That this is the case emerges through an initial consideration of the COVID-19 vaccine. My point is that this particular vaccine, more than others, is a technological device, and thus it enshrines a technocratic understanding of the human being. It is the ultimate result of postmodern culture's way of addressing the current epidemic. A vaccine of this type is not, properly speaking, an alternative to lockdowns and restrictive measures. Rather, it is the ideal instantiation of the anthropology underlying these very same lockdowns and allied restrictive measures. It is the most powerful weapon in modern medicine war against the virus, in the context of modern man's war against suffering and death. It is viewed as the best instrument of self-salvation on man's part. In other words, the overall judgment on the anti-COVID vaccine cannot be severed from a judgment on the mentality that has filled it with meanings that, in their turn, find expression in the production and the functioning of the vaccine itself. Many physicians and politicians have been affirming the necessity of vaccination as the only available instrument against the novel coronavirus. As a matter of fact, the use of the vaccine is viewed as the ideal therapy from the perspective of the technocratic society. Today, it is clear that the anti-COVID vaccine is not a vaccine in the traditional sense of the word. It is an mRNA therapy, which reduces the symptoms of the possible contagion, but does not prevent individuals from being infected or from transmitting the virus to others. My point is not that the mRNA vaccine has no therapeutic effect. It appears that it does, but that it achieves its therapeutic effect by acting upon the body in a violent and manipulative way. A technological device is different from a technical tool insofar as the former defines the relationship between a subject and object in terms of power. That is to say, independently from the final and formal causality of the object itself. Both subject and object end up being instrumentalized for a purpose that is imposed from outside of their mutual relationship, so that this latter is not only affected, so the relationship is not only affected, but deeply modified in its essence. In our context, the object on which the instrument operates is not the virus or the disease. It is the immune system, and therefore the human body upon which the vaccine acts. Traditional ways of vaccinating do not necessarily establish a manipulative relationship with the human body. Both live and dead vaccines introduce the pathogen in a mitigated or deactivated form, and nonetheless, this is enough to cause an immune reaction. This kind of vaccine appears as a technical tool, insofar as its working depends on what we may term the integral goodness of the body's own health and the self-healing capacity. In this case, the vaccine depends upon the body's capacity to generate a natural immunity and preserve its own organic form, that is, its health. Instead of a subject-object relationship of controller and controlled, we see the dynamism of a dialogue between two subjects. The body is not dumb matter, but rather it is a human in as much as it has the attention and the freedom to take care of its own wholeness. Therefore, vaccination and medication in general are human when they are the extension of the human body's immune system. Vaccines and medicine become inhuman when they take over the body's task by introducing other goals that are extrinsically imposed at the expense of the object's subjectivity. The biotechnological innovation that has been introduced with the mRNA therapy causes an interesting reversal of the relationship between nature and culture. It is not the vaccine that depends on the human body, in which case it could be defined as an immunizing instrument insofar as it is the extension of the body's self-immunizing capacity. On the contrary, the acquisition of natural immunity is bracketed out and even totally neglected, so that the body is made mechanically dependent on the vaccine and defined as per se non-working and working only if and as vaccinated. Note that the political debate in the US, at least, tends to ignore that there are millions of people who have naturally acquired immunity. Only the vaccines are admitted as a therapeutic. Clearly enough, the ultimate reference of medical science, at this point reduced to the prevention of diseases that the patient does not actually have, but may contract, is no longer the healthy body. That is, it is no longer the body whose parts constitute an integral whole, insofar as they are ordered according to the form that is always already provided by the whole itself. Rather, the reference point is the corpse, or at any rate, the ill body, meaning the body that has no form or is deformed to such an extent that it needs a reordering intervention. Rather than educating the body to be what it is in its wholeness, it appears more efficient to order the body how to behave according to a cause-effect relation that reduces bodily activities to mere physiological functions. Medical doctors, often unwittingly, approach the body as if it were a machine that needs to be fixed. The problem of modern medicine is the bad anthropology on which its success is founded. Its modern presuppositions deny the truth of ancient and medieval anthropology, which instead would provide the categories that medicine itself needs to look at the body as living matter. On the body's life, i.e., on its intrinsic goodness, ultimately depends medicine's very success. Man's physical existence is from the get-go an integrated and ordered whole. The body grows organically precisely because it is informed by a soul, that formal and final causality which allows the organism to face potential pathologies. A scientific anthropology silences the subjective features of the human body, thus preventing the person from growing in adherence to the truth of her own being. As in the case of lockdowns, masks, and social distancing, the anti-COVID vaccine enshrines a non-relational anthropology, one which defines man's historical existence regardless of the constitutive relationship with his own body, with others, and with God. The systematic use of genetic therapy, as the mRNA vaccine is an example of a gene therapy, although at the lower end of the scale of what is possible, puts modern medicine, at least theoretically, in the position of being able to defeat every disease, or at least to appear to do so. Potentially, human suffering can be eliminated from human existence. That is to say, this can always be presented as the coming utopia toward which medical inventions are oriented. It will be enough to treat the body with the regular treatments for each of the possible anomalies that can surface. From within this perspective, death is reduced to a mere possibility among other possibilities at man's disposal, from among which man may choose, with death itself being something that is continually put off until the physician or the patient's relatives chooses to set a limit. This model, however, is the absolute negation of being's intrinsic goodness in its actual reality, along with the pursuit of becoming's infinite possibilities. The acceptance of such a paradigm represents a red flag that points to the technocratic character of modern medicine. Once the sense of nature as being born and hence being made is lost, human action becomes limitless self-determination, or rather, it ends up being determined by technological progress. If, by contrast, medical practice respected the person's organic form, there is a realized from within the body's relationship with the soul, and hence ultimately with God, even biotechnology could make a genuine contribution to the intrinsic end of the body itself, which is its self-healing capacity in order to preserve life.
Thank you so much, Father Stefano. I think that was a really profound and original take on what is going on in the world right now. I'm not going to offer any reaction of my own right now. I've already spoken too much. And given that Governor Brown is the first who may have to leave, I'd be happy to let you be the first to ask a question or make an observation, and then we can go around to everybody. Do you need more time to think things through? Or
no, I can offer what is probably a very limited thought or response. First of all, I do very much appreciate this framing of technology with respect to its inhuman aspects, and how medicine and technology can affect what it is to be human, and can shape our the very sense that we have of ourselves. My friend Ivan Illich dealt with some of these issues in Medical Nemesis, talking about, and he often spoke how technology shapes us, how we don't use technology so much as technology uses us, and how technology not only does things, but technology says things, and it actually has this symbolic fallout. He also dealt with suffering and the what he called the art of suffering. So I noticed similarities here, but I also have to bring the concrete experience of my own life. So I'm a guy who is taking blood thinners. I've taken, so what other medicines do I take? Oh, I take something to prevent afibrillation. All right, and so I don't know what that does. Is that like an mRNA vaccine, or is that just like taking an aspirin? And I also noted I also think of the idea that vaccines is one of the things that actually works in medicine. a lot of what, certainly in medical nemesis, there's a lot of destruction in iatrogenic impacts. They say 100,000 people died by going to the hospital. So when Illich said the biggest threat to health is the health industry itself, that brings up this idea. On the other hand, oh, and by the way, Illich had this growth on his face, which I think might have been some kind of basal cell syndrome, a basal cell carcinoma, which he never took off. And whether he did that to suffer in the spirit of Christ, I'm not sure. But that was certainly one interpretation that I had. Now, I've had on my nose a basal cell, and I had taken off. So I'm trying to understand the various approaches to science, and you know, what the body being altered. I did find interesting this idea that the other vaccines actually work with the body as opposed to redesigning the body. And I think Illich had another thing where he talked about the tool. And he said, today we're in a world of systems, which aren't tools. Tools are something you can grasp. And systems are something that erodes the body. And he certainly felt that the elimination of the body went against the whole notion of incarnation. So there's a lot here that I think about, but I have to tell you, each morning as I take my propathanin to stop my AFib, or the key hasn't come back for a year, which I feel happy about, or a blood thinner, because my family has a history of strokes. My father had strokes, my sister had strokes. So the doctor says, you better keep your blood thin. You might avoid a stroke there. Now, maybe that's more like an old-fashioned medicine. And I also have to add one more point here. The two men who I most respect, Gregory Bateson and Ivan Illich, from very, very different traditions. Both of them reacted with horror to the idea of genetic engineering. I remember when this topic was brought up at the UC Board of Regents back in the 70s. Both did not like the idea of altering the genetic makeup. And Bateson talked about the difference in the human body between soma and genetic. Soma was the body you could exercise and strengthen the muscles, but then they would go back, but you didn't affect the nature. I mean, the body had its persistence, which was the genome. And the genome and the genetic structure persisted and slowly evolved over time. But it wasn't something you could alter in the same way that you could alter the body. So he did make a distinction between long, fundamental principles and aspects of the body and ones that are more easily altered. Anyway, I just offer that some thoughts, and I don't know whether it will illuminate or obfuscate, but it's what comes to my mind.
Maybe since this is directed at Father Stefano, the floor is yours, but I just wanted to, given the questions about matters of fact to a certain extent about the nature of what the mRNA vaccines do, to what extent they are, into which of the two frameworks that Governor Brown just set forth they fit. It's, Stefano, maybe I think that take these interesting comments in any direction you want, but perhaps you may want to ask questions of your own, because this is a good opportunity for debate on these difficult questions.
Sorry, I don't know if I understood. In what sense ask question on my own? Say.
No, I mean on the nature, we have with us medical professionals among others. So And so we could have a debate here to some extent about this whole question of which medications act as tools and which ones act as manipulators that mechanistically act on the body. I think that's just a broader question.
Yeah. No, well, for sure, Dr. Hariyati can help us in this, or also Dr. Bhattarcharya. I would say this, reacting to what Governor Brown said.
Could you tell me, I'm just on a program, I'll be there in 5 minutes, okay? Tell me to wait outside. Yeah.
Just one brief comment. So I don't think we have to reject modern science, which would probably be an easier way out. In some sense, it would be easier because you just reject what you don't like, which is precisely what a technological culture would do. But besides that, besides this point, it's also impossible because we are immersed into that. I would say, the goal would be not to reject medicine, but to allow medicine to be itself, which is the art of medicine. When I say art, and so we can connect this point to the question of technological device and tool. The art in the ancient sense of techne has to do with technical tools, which is means that are used in order to pursue an end, a good, an intrinsic goodness, an absolute goodness, which is embedded into reality, into the very nature of the object, in the teleological nature of the object. In order to that, you need tools. In fact, I would say the systems of a system of tools is precisely what technology is. But that is a deformation or an abuse of the original understanding of techne, the original understanding of tool. So there will be, I think, the task to work within a modern medicine and looking for its original core, its original truth. Regarding the question of technological device versus tool, I had this intuition from the beginning that being the mRNA vaccine a product of this technological culture, this technological mentality, anthropology had to be seen in the very functioning of the vaccine, not just in the production. That was also a debated question, but in the functioning and the way in which it approaches the object. And so I worked through this intuition, comparing the traditional live and dead vaccine with the new technology. And what appeared to me is that, and then it's a question, and I asked for a contribution from the two doctors who are present. My intuition was that the new technology is technocratic for two reasons. First, you don't have a reality, the reality of the virus, although in a deactivated form, but you have an appearance of the virus. So it works through the dialectics between appearance and reality. The body is not given to put itself in relationship with a virus, but just but with a simulacrum, we can say, which is the spike protein, which is not the virus. So this was the first point. Another point is that, which is related, if you want, is that the mRNA vaccine doesn't trust the self-healing capacity to the body, and instead it tricks the body, making the body think that there is a virus in itself. Why? And therefore that the body is sick, while the body is not sick at all. So this trick, this cheating in a way the body was, to me, a sign of the manipulative and violent approach that the mRNA vaccine has vis-a-vis the body. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know what you think about this, and
I'm happy to comment a little bit on this, Paul. From a pragmatic point of view, my understanding is that the mRNA technology was chosen by Operation Warp Speed, which is an interesting title for that project of ramping up a vaccine in light of your comments on scientism and culture. But in any case, it was chosen because it could be ramped up on a mass production scale much more quickly than traditional vaccines. And it could get to the testing phase much more quickly than traditional vaccines. And if we're thinking about efficiency as sort of the central good or the highest good of a technocratic paradigm, that's an interesting observation, I think. I agree with you that these do not function like traditional vaccines, and they interact with the body in ways that that seem to command and control differently than a traditional vaccine, which in some way tries to mimic the virus without the virus's pathogenicity and stimulate the immune system to do what it would do in the face of that virus if it encountered the live version. And I will add that in this case, the mRNA codes for the spike protein, which is expressed on our own cells and stimulates the immune system to react to something that is now being expressed in our own tissue, which may account for some of the adverse effects of the vaccine as well. And I'm saying all of this recognizing that the vaccine has therapeutic value in diminishing severe symptoms, though, as you said, you're correct that it doesn't prevent infection and transmission to others. So another aspect of this technology that was supposed to work in a particular way that didn't was it was originally engineered and designed to stay in the deltoid muscle, where there was an anchoring mechanism to help it stay only in the tissue where it was injected. And we now know, based on Pfizer's own data, their own animal data, that it likely doesn't do that, that it's distributed throughout the body and expressed on various tissues of the body. So I think the technology does differ in pretty fundamental ways from traditional vaccines. And I think you're right that it does tell us something about the direction that medical technology has moved in terms of understanding the body not as a living organism with its own intrinsic unity and form and ends, but as a kind of raw material that can be tinkered with like the engine of a car. And this seems to be a pretty fundamental shift in understanding a living organism. Your remark that the corpse was sort of the imaginative paradigm for modern medicine reminded me of my colleague at St. Louis University, Jeff Bishop, who wrote a book arguing that the paradigm for the treatment and model in the ICU is precisely the dead body. The name of his book was The Anticipatory Corpse, medicine treating the body as though it were already this kind of inert matter. One other remark, and this could take the conversation in a different direction. I think there were a lot of aspects of your talk, Stefano, that pointed not just to sort of science and technology, but to political or civic or social realities, which reminded me of some fundamental changes in the way that we're interacting with one another since the pandemic began. And now the highest form of civic participation that's sort of held up as the model of being a good citizen or a good neighbor is not a face-to-face encounter with fellow citizens, hammering things out at the local level, getting engaged with public life by gathering with fellow citizens. But the highest form of civic participation now is social distancing, is ensuring that our interactions are only technologically mediated, as we're doing right now from behind a screen. And that strikes me as a very sort of fundamental change, not just in the way that we understand science and technology and medicine, but in the way that we live together. That seems to me to be an aspect of your remarks that are worthy of comment as well.
That was fascinating, Aaron. I want to make sure everyone has a chance to respond and to ask questions. So, Dr. Bhattarcharya, and then Adam, why don't we follow up quickly?
Yeah, I'll try to keep my remarks brief, but first let me just start by saying this was an absolutely fascinating essay and discussion, and I think you have hit on something very, very important about the relationship between technology and what it means to be human. I have a couple of remarks that'll push back slightly on some of the points, but the broad thrust of your argument I entirely agree with. So let me just start by citing the story from the Tower of Babel. I brought the verse up. It says, "And they said, let us build a city in a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. Let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." The problem with the builders of this tower wasn't that they were building a tower. I don't think there's anything wrong with architecture in the Bible. I think the problem was the purpose to which they put it. For them, the tower had become an idol that they effectively worshipped. And I think that is the thrust of your essay, that we've made science into an idol as opposed to putting it into the proper place in the human story. Just to give you 3 points, I think, that are related to this. So first, I want to talk about lockdown, and in particular, the technological prerequisites of lockdown. Lockdown would never have happened if we did not have Zoom. Lockdown would never have happened if we did not have Zoom. Lockdown is an example of trickle-down epidemiology. A certain class of people benefited, the class of people who did not lose their jobs or whose livelihoods were not threatened because they could be replaced by Zoom. Whereas if just a few years ago, before this technology existed, we all would have shared in the harm of lockdown to some extent, rather than a class being a very influential class being protected. And I think lockdown would. So you can see here technology enabling a dehumanizing policy designed to separate people from one another, which has led to enormous harm to the vulnerable and the poor around the world that could not have happened but for a particular technology itself. Zoom is not a bad. I'm really glad to be able to talk with you all, but in service of this evil, it is a bad, right? Let me talk about the vaccines. I guess I want to push back a little bit about the vaccine redesigning our body. All vaccines redesign our body to some extent. All those vaccines train our immune systems to respond to in a particular way, hopefully a productive way, to the pathogens it's supposed to protect against. And this vaccine does the same thing in that sense. It's training, it uses a different mechanism, it uses the mRNA mechanism to do that, but it's doing that, it's doing the same thing. I do agree with you, Father Stefano, about one thing on the vaccine, and that is it is different in that, unlike most vaccines in wide use, this vaccine does not stop disease transmission. It's not sterilizing in that sense, especially after a few months, whereas it still does protect quite well against severe disease. So let me come back to the theme then. If the vaccine then were used in a human way, it would be used to protect the vulnerable. it would be used to take the set of people who are vulnerable to the disease, which tends to be older populations, a 1,000-fold difference in the risk of severe disease between old and the young. Young are very, very, so thank God, protected against COVID relative to the old, where there's more than 80% of the deaths have been over 65. So if the vaccine were used in a humane way, it would be used to protect the vulnerable and reduce the fear of COVID and essentially eliminate the demand for lockdown. Instead, what has happened is the vaccine has been used in a dehumanizing way with an idea to force everyone to take it with the hope that it would stop disease transmission, which has clearly failed because the vaccine does not do that. It does not stop disease transmission. It's instead been used to create a new outclass of people and divide society as opposed to use it to heal society, which it could be very easily have done. Again, this is an example of the vaccine as an idol. Rather than recognizing it for the amazing thing that it is, using it for that purpose, we've instead treated it as an idol and asked it to do something it cannot do. And in doing so, have created enormous social division. Third comment is about, and this is, I thought, fascinating, about why have people denied natural immunity? Why have people denied the possibility of early treatment? There actually are early treatments that are approved, such as the monoclonal antibodies. But the denial of robust immunity after infection of COVID recovery has been an amazing thing to me. The scientific evidence is absolutely rock solid. There's no question that people who recover from COVID have very strong and robust immunity. 0.3% of people who recover from COVID in a year later are reinfected. That's much better than the vaccine. And yet, science has denied this, and I think your comments are very much on point, Father Stefano. In a sense, what's happened is, if natural immunity is right, if there is the possibility of early treatment, well, then medicine can be used for individual health, individual benefit. It can be used essentially in a humanizing way. Instead, what has happened by denying natural immunity, by denying the possibility of early treatment, effective early treatment, what has happened is a massive push for the collectivization of health. Everyone's health depends on everybody else. And therefore, if I don't comply, I'm harming everybody else. And I think, again, this is in service of this idol of scientism, this idol that's using of science to reform society in a direction that certain people want. As I said, I think that you can see from the hints about the trickle-down epidemiology, what class of people I think are behind, are sort of have the most benefit from this, rather than using these technologies in a humanizing way. So it's not the technologies themselves, but their use for social control, their use for collectivization of health, and their use for service of the laptop class that I think are really the major problems.
I love that expression, the laptop class. I don't know if you came up with that's got to go viral. That's great. I think that's fascinating comments. Adam, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I wanted to add another dimension to this, because I think that a lot of what we've been talking about, at least initially, is sort of the kind of internal self-understanding, right? Or an understanding of sort of personal dignity and the relationship between body and soul in a kind of self-contained way. And I think that is a strong counter-argument against technocratic modifications of the human body, or encroachment on human dignity, or too narrow a focus on physical health. But I wonder if this is a full enough picture as a critique of technocratic power, because in a sense there are three sides to a triangle, right? So there's technocracy, there's kind of human dignity and human flourishing, and there's liberty. And a lot of the critique of technocracy, I think, has been from the standpoint of liberty and social pluralism, and the encroachment of technocracy on diverse spaces in society. And one of the ways of approaching this, I think, is that a lot of what you said earlier, Stefano, about sort of human dignity and the hierarchy of goods above health, and you mentioned this in the article that was excerpted on the Simone Weil website, as well. There is a hierarchy of goods of health, but also as a sort of political and social fact, it sometimes helps also to talk about plurality of goods, or the ways in which people engage other human beings in different dimensions, in different circuits of social belonging. And I think one of the reasons why many of us have felt uncomfortable about the exercise of power by the state during the pandemic is often it has not taken account of these different dimensions of human flourishing, these different independent social spaces in society. It's reduced everything to this kind of yardstick of health and authority and management of the public and so on. And I think that often the technocratic mentality is not only about managing people in that sense, it's also about reducing social life to fairly narrow dimensions, and a kind of statistical or algorithmic understanding of human behavior or human well-being. And I think that if we're only looking at human dignity sort of one by one, rather than in terms of these multidimensional social relationships, we're often not giving a very strong critique of what is wrong with technocracy. And part of the problem with technocracy is that it is encroaching upon society. It's encroaching upon all these different ways in which people engage with one another. And I think that there are traditions of social thought which take account of that, whether it's Bertrand de Jouvenel in his History of Power, whether it's Abraham Kuyper and Herman Dooyeweerd, and looking at sphere sovereignty and various kinds of pluralism. But it seems that that kind of diverse external engagements of the human personality also needs to be part of the critique.
And I would add to that, even if we're only looking at human flourishing in terms of health, we've taken an excessively narrow sort of metric or definition of health during the last year and a half. I'm a psychiatrist. I wrote a piece last year during the lockdowns as they were extending much longer than we were initially promised. And I began to see that what was happening, even though it wasn't being articulated clearly, when 2 weeks to flatten the curve became, we have to stay at home in order to save lives, it was clear that staying at home did not eradicate the virus. It only slowed down the spread of the virus. As soon as we stopped staying at home, the virus would begin to spread again. And this wasn't making sense to me until I realized that what people were hoping but not saying was that we could stay locked down until we had an effective vaccine. And at the time, the public health leaders didn't want to say that because it would appear to be an enormous gamble. Now, in retrospect, we can see, okay, we actually managed to do that, but there was no guarantee when the search for a vaccine started that a viable vaccine would be available as quickly as it was. And I think at the time, if you would have told people that's the reason that we're staying home, most people would have rejected that kind of gamble. But what I was concerned about at that time were the rising rates of mental health problems, suicide, addictions, depression, anxiety, especially among young people, including the death by suicide of a young man that I've known since he was born, who was best friends with my son growing up, and during the lockdowns took his own life at the age of 17. So I wrote this piece called The Other Pandemic, trying to draw attention to the mental health crisis that the lockdowns were creating. And I was distressed that it seemed very difficult to draw folks' attention away from COVID case curves or COVID death counts to the other effects of the lockdowns. Even trying to measure those effects, not just at the sort of human level or the social level or the spiritual level, which, Adam, I think your remarks alluded to the need to attend to those goods. But even just looking at the level of measurable health outcomes, this paradigm that we were operating with was taking an excessively narrow view of health and focusing exclusively on one pathogen. And as a physician, and as a physician who's in a discipline that tries to look at health holistically, that struck me as profoundly kind of myopic and narrow, and ultimately harmful if our only goal was to save lives. This was not a good policy. I don't think that goal was appropriately situated within a broader context. But even just taking that goal at face value, it seemed like a rather reckless policy. And I think we're going to see the effects of that policy on all-cause mortality for many years to come. I think Dr. Bhattarcharya could comment more on that, but I think the narrowness of the technocratic paradigm is not just narrow because it focuses on medical outcomes alone, but even that you can get caught up in a system that focuses only on a few medical outcomes to the exclusion of others, and that strikes me as bad, even from the point of view of just health policy or health-related metrics.
No, there's no question about that, Aaron. I mean, the harm from the lockdowns have been devastating already. The UN says that there were 100 million additional people that were thrown into poverty and at risk of starvation worldwide. 250,000 in March of this year said 250,000 deaths in additional deaths from starvation in South Asian children alone. The only question in my mind at this point is what order of magnitude the harms of the lockdowns are in terms of human life relative to the lives it saved, which my first order estimate is not that many, because you say it delayed cases rather than, at best, delayed cases rather than prevented them.
Wanting to check in with you because we had originally thought of this as being an hour in length, although obviously we've only scratched the surface and there's plenty more to do. Do people want to stay on for another 5 or 10 minutes? Would that be okay? And I'd like to suggest, while everyone is still around, first of all, that people read Father Stefano's it's excerpts from a much longer essay, and I'm going to on our website. It looks like the answer is that not everyone can stay for much longer. I see that, Dr.
I can stay a bit longer if people want. I see we've got some Q&A in the chat as well.
I think just a couple of minutes more, because there's a bunch of questions in the Q&A, and some of them are quite good questions, but I don't know. Something is telling me that we're not going to be able to get to them given the time that we have left. But maybe I could promise to send those questions on. If people want to reach me, they can write to the Simone Weil Center at gmail.com, and I can make sure I have your email and send those questions on to either Father Stefano or to others to try to get a response. But my impression is that this is a really fruitful dialogue across disciplines. We haven't really even begun to address, Adam, the points that you made about dealing with diverse goods within the political order, instead of just such a narrow range of technocratically determined important things, which important according to the people apparently who run the technocracy or the laptop class, as Jay put it. But I just think that whether we do this as a public Zoom seminar or not, I'd like to propose that we just keep talking among ourselves, preferably in person. But if not, the thought I've had is that it's something that a very is William Irwin Thompson, who was kind of a hippie historian, culturologist in the 70s and 80s, made the observation that when the Roman Empire was at its height, and Simone Weil had nothing very positive to say about the Roman Empire, incidentally. They also had great technology. They built these roads, these amazing roads all over the Roman Empire. And then the Christian missionaries used those roads to transmit the message of Christ to the far reaches of the Roman Empire and collapsed it. And this may be wildly optimistic, but sometimes I think that this the new roads of the Roman Empire is Zoom, and we can use those roads for our own ends. But a little bit, who knows? There's kind of a lot. I think that the apostles nonetheless could speak to people face to face, and I think that does make a difference. Anyway, but why don't everyone just say another, like for one more minute, have your final wrap up, and then I think we should let people go. Why don't we start with Adam or Aaron? Why don't you start, and then we'll give Father Stefano the last word.
Sure. So I'll start just by answering one of the questions in the Q&A box regarding whether the mRNA vaccines can change our body in such a way that those changes are passed on to one's offspring. And the answer, as far as we know, is no. It seems very unlikely and implausible that there would be a way for that to happen unless it turned out that the mRNA vaccines changed our gametes in some way. And at this point, we don't have evidence that that is the case. But this gets to a kind of basic distinction when we talk about gene therapies between somatic gene therapies that just affect the individual recipient, taking my bone marrow cells out, doing some genetic gene editing or genetic manipulation on those cells to activate my white blood cells to attack the cancer in my body. This is one of the applications that's been FDA approved. Put those cells back into my own body, and then those cells help to fight the cancer. If things go awry and that doesn't work well, or that causes me some sort of harm, I'm the only person harmed by that. And so the traditional medical ethics of informed consent work well for understanding gene therapies that are somatic. The germline gene therapies work on either gametes, the sperm or the eggs, or on embryos, which will mean that those gene editing changes eventually affect that embryo's gametes if they're brought to birth. And they will be passed on through the generations indefinitely. So the first thing to say about the mRNA vaccines is that we don't have evidence that they change our DNA. They are just an intermediate step between the DNA and the protein. And they basically help our body to produce the spike protein, even though the spike protein is not coded in our own DNA. Typically, it would go from our DNA to messenger RNA to a protein. This just inserts the messenger RNA into that system. And we don't have evidence, although there's some speculation, that the mRNA vaccines could affect the DNA in a way that would be permanent or affect the DNA of the gametes in a way that would be passed on to offspring. So long-winded explanation, but I think the short answer is probably, most likely, no. It's not going to affect our descendants. And so I think Father Stefano's remarks that this is sort of low-level gene therapy or genetic-based therapy, and the mRNA is part of the genetic system, is probably correct, that there are other potential applications of gene-related technology that from an ethical point of view are much more concerning, that I think we should be still paying attention to and not distracted from, because those applications, germline gene editing and so forth, are soon going to be upon us. In fact, there was an announcement not long before the pandemic of germline gene editing being done on 2 twins in China who were brought to birth. Some people may remember that announcement in the news, and the Chinese scientist involved in that was censured by his own government, and it was roundly condemned by the scientific community. But since then, there have been a lot of folks in the scientific community talking about the possibility of using germline gene editing to try to eradicate various inheritable genetic diseases. So that conversation would take us very far afield, but as an answer to the question in the chat box, I wanted to kind of give you that framework for thinking about these technologies.
Thank you. Adam, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I make a couple of observations. One, I do think these conversations are very much worth continuing in different formats. I think, as Paul said, we've only just scratched the surface of a lot of these issues, and I think we can develop the conversation in multiple directions. I guess the only other observation I'd make is maybe borrowing a different metaphor. I like the idea of using technology for different, social and cultural and moral purposes, and using Zoom as the Roman roads for spreading alternative messages and so on. I think that the other metaphor that I think could be used is sort of inoculating for liberty, or inoculating for human dignity in a sense, because in a way this is a kind of unintended trial run, right? I mean, it's been, in the grand scheme of things, probably fairly low-level, short-term restrictions on people. It may seem like a lot, from the perspective of the last year and a half, but I think in any world historical sense, or if we look forward to where this could be going in 100 years, it's probably a very mild, brief set of restrictions. But I guess the question becomes, what lessons does society draw from this? I mean, one lesson is that people will put up with quite a lot, and then we would see this kind of gradual ratcheting of technocratic intervention and regulation and encroachment on human dignity, ending with some pretty dark dystopian social arrangements a generation or two or three out. But the other way we can look at this is sort of like inoculating, right? Like creating a kind of immune response, right? I mean, if people see some of what this could foreshadow, if people see some of the misuses of, probably in many cases quite well-intentioned, even if somewhat short-sighted interventions, if we see how this has been misused and what kinds of assumptions and techniques of control have been tested or foreshadowed, it's very possible that civilization could have a kind of immune response to this, and we could figure out ways of heading off this ratcheting up of control in the future. So I think this very much could go either way, and it depends largely on how people frame the reaction and the risks that are involved.
Brilliant. Yeah, excellent point, Adam. Let's do a follow up on all of those things. And so, a couple minutes left. Stefano, I'll take the floor, and then we'll say goodbye and apologize to everyone whose questions we didn't get to. But with such a high-level panel, you've got to accept that philosophically. Go ahead.
2 minutes, I think, are few for the number of things that I would like to say. Responding to what the other panelists have said. So I will be as brief as possible. So first of all, the point that Adam raised about the hierarchy of goods, I totally agree, 100%. In fact, in the essay that unfortunately I wrote in Italian and I shared with Paul, I also talk about that. And I would add this point. I mean, I understand Adam's concern, which should be in the foreground. I realized that when I started to read Giorgio Agamben, who is an Italian philosopher, who wrote a lot in the last months. I mean, especially last year during the time of lockdowns in Italy. And I have to say, what he has to say was quite interesting to me. I think he's right on a lot of things that he says. But then I started to read his works, especially his main work, which is Homo Sacer. And I realized that ultimately what was lacking in him, in his understanding of bare life, was precisely that hierarchy of goods that Adam was referring to. So he conceives of nature and culture, we can say natural animal life and political life as ultimately in opposition. So not able to integrate each other or to be kind of a protagonist of a fruitful mediation. And here I want to make a brief point on what also Dr. Bhattarcharya said about the fact that even, even traditional vaccines act on the body. And this is true. In fact, I don't want to deny that we have, as a human being, we are called to dominion, as the Bible says, on nature. The problem is that when this dominion, say, or this relationship between nature and culture is not reciprocal and therefore is not fruitful, but we either idolize, to use Bhattacharya's language, we either idolize nature or culture. I think technology and technological mentality is this latter kind of idolatry, the idolatry of culture that makes nature disappear. And ultimately, I would like to say just one more thing. I totally agree with Dr. KHERIATY about the narrow view on health and the pathogen in general. And this was precisely my point. In order to understand why science is bad or medicine is bad, when I say bad, I don't mean from a moral point of view in the first place also, but in the second place, I refer to the bad anthropology and the bad metaphysics that founds a bad science and a bad medicine. So we have to look there. In fact, and I close, also to address Paul's point on Zoom. Of course, we are in a way forced. I mean, we are called, I would say it's better. It's called to live in a technocratic world. And so we will always deal with technological devices. The question that we have to ask ourselves every time that we do that we allow technology to shape our lives, the question that we have to ask is, what is the price that I'm paying for this? There is always a price in terms of human experience, in terms of affirming the truth, affirming the meaning of life and the meaning of, I would say, being itself. So I think these are a very fruitful, from my point of view, also interesting exercise. Every time to ask the question, what is the price that I am paying for this? And then, in light of that, the answer to this question, then you are called to make a practical judgment and to make a decision whether to avail yourself of that technological device, whether it be Zoom or an mRNA vaccine, is worth it.
Okay. I apologize for the constraints of time, but I actually have to leave pretty soon for another meeting as well. But I think that it's better to have frequent meetings, even if they're briefer, because I think that one of the things that our advisors of the Simone Weil Center said early on when we first ran into this issue of having to, instead of meet in person, which was the fundamental concept of our center from the very beginning, was to bring people from Russia and America and England and Germany, et cetera, together in small groups and for long periods of time. Precisely on the grounding of the sort of the Christian personalist tradition that I've been trained in philosophically. It's all about seeing the person's face and not behind masks, for God's sake. But anyway, but what our advisors said, it was that it's exhausting to be on Zoom for a long time. That's one of the problems, is that it deforms time, and it makes time tiresome, rather than being able to enjoy people's presence at a coffee shop, as Stefano and I recently did in Bethesda. So let's trade emails among ourselves on how we can figure that out. But in the meanwhile, we'll just keep fighting on. I think this is I think all of our Zoom seminars have nonetheless been very valuable and interesting. And this is right up there. This has been really high quality thinking. Thank you, all of you, and we'll see you next time.